la famille.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the co-founders of the family. I have a background in government. I worked for many years for the French government, and so today in the family I'm mostly in charge of every problem that our startup entrepreneurs have with the government. And so hence that is the basis for my experience in that field, mostly in France, but more recently as we have decided to go to grow at a European level, we've been investing a lot in understanding Europe as a regulatory environment for startup and how to make it easier for entrepreneurs with disruptive models to grow, even if regulations, they don't comply with existing regulations. So since we've been here only for a few days, we don't have a large screen yet. So I have a very tiny screen. So we're talking about regulatory hacking here. As you can guess, the concept of regulatory hacking is based on growth hacking. It's been invented by, well, as far as I know, it's been coined by an incubator located in Washington, D.C. in the US called 1776, in reference to the date of the year of the Declaration of Independence. And that incubator has been founded by people who thought that with the digital economy growing, more and more startups would be confronted with the government, with regulations enacted by the government. And so it's worth investing in making it easier for entrepreneurs to interact with the government, to lobby the government in favor of regulatory frameworks more favorable for innovation, and so on and so on. So the so-called official definition of growth hacking by that incubator, which you can look up online, goes as written here. So growth hacking it's about a strategy combining public policy and alternatives to traditional marketing for startups to successfully scale in the next wave of the digital economy. So as I mentioned, it's based on the precedent of growth hacking. If you're an entrepreneur or if you've been working in startups already for quite a time, you've heard about growth hacking. It says that the most important thing that a startup entrepreneur should seek at an early stage is growth. And to find growth when you're nothing, nobody knows your product, nobody knows you, you don't have shareholders, you don't have employees, you still have to find your first customers. You have to hack the growth. And so growth hacking is an extensive toolbox to hack the growth at the earlier stage. And the idea here with regulatory hacking is that for certain startups in certain industries, it's not enough to hack the growth. You also have to hack the regulations, because regulations matter in your industry, and regulations matter for more and more for basically every entrepreneur. So why does it matter, regulatory hacking? The first reason I think why regulatory hacking matters is that more and more startups are now entering tangible industries and regulated markets. There were easy markets to conquer for entrepreneurs 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, when there was nothing. So every market was here to seize, and obviously the first generations of entrepreneurs decided to go for the easier one. So Google was in content, Yahoo was in content, Amazon duplicated the old model of mail order retail, and a lot of entrepreneurs had ideas about music, about media, about the press, about video even, but all those were obvious business models because there were business models built around intangible assets on mostly unregulated markets. So obviously there were regulations when it comes to copyright and so on, but it's not as tight and as difficult as regulations in other industries such as healthcare, transportation, energy, agriculture, and so on. And today, all the good positions, strategic positions, have been seized already by entrepreneurs on those easy markets. And so new entrepreneurs, when they look up for opportunities, discover that the only positions still to be seized today are those in difficult markets or difficult industries where you have a lot of regulations. So the reason why regulations matter today and did matter as much before is because new startups are led to innovate not on easy market but on difficult, tough, highly regulated markets. A second reason is that incumbent companies have finally discovered that startups were here to take their business and to replace them as the leaders on their market. So where the music industry didn't really see Napster and then didn't really see Apple coming, but today there are a lot of consultants, there are a lot of conferences, there are a lot of mentions of startups in the media. And so every CEO leading an incumbent company is aware that someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow, a startup will enter their market and will try to take their place. And so they're so aware that when they see a tiny startup, they instantly lobby the government to make it harder for the entrepreneurs to penetrate the market. For that reason, regulations matter far more than before. The third reason why regulations matter is that you may have noticed that technology is not so loved as it used to be a few years ago. Today, when you talk on the street about technology, when you go and meet traditional CEOs or politicians or ministers, you ask them about technology, what they'll say is it's the end of privacy, it's about job destruction, those companies don't pay taxes, and so on and so on. So you have a lot of fears building around technology, and for that reason, regulations is often used as a way to slow down innovation and slow down the startups. And so it gets more difficult to build startups in an adverse environment such as that we have today. So another question is regulatory hacking really new? Didn't every innovator for decades or even centuries had to fight against the system and go around the existing rules and so on? So obviously every tech company, even in the easier years, 10 years or 20 years ago, had to fight against regulations. Google had a lot of problems on the copyright front. Napster was closed down by the courts because they were sued by the music industry. And so it's not new when you talk about Uber having problems in that city or this city. It's not really new. Google, Napster, and a lot of other companies 10 years or 20 years ago already had that kind of problem. The difference is that at the time, everybody had the benefit of inconscience. They weren't conscious that disruption was so huge and would reshuffle value creation and will totally disrupt existing business models. The entrepreneurs were inconscious, so they went, built their companies without even realizing that they were violating copyright law. The story of Google proves that when they were building that search engine in California, they didn't even realize that there were laws making it more complicated to search for content online, to index the content, to display the content for the users. All of this was problematic when it came to copyright. And at some point, they had so many problems with right holders that they decided to finally open an office in Washington, D.C. And so it was a major turn in the history of Google when the engineers decided that they finally had to invest in understanding the political context, understanding the rules, lobbying the government, get to know the members of Congress, etc. Whereas before they really sincerely thought that solving problems was enough to have your way. So it wasn't that, and so they didn't realize it mattered. The government, for a moment, didn't realize that people were building disruptive business models in Silicon Valley, and at some point, all those people woke up to the fact that there was problems between new models and existing rules, and so today everybody knows that, and so you can't have your way as easily as Google had 20 years ago. So finally, so hence the reason for investing in understanding regulatory hacking and building a new discipline. So 1776 does it in the US. They're willing, apparently, when you read what they publish, when you hear their podcasts or watch their videos, they're willing to invest in building a global network of incubators, accelerators, venture capital funds, confronted with regulatory issues in different countries. But so far, the concept didn't really make its way to Europe. And so as we are the family and we've been confronted with a lot of regulatory problems in France with our French entrepreneurs, France-based entrepreneurs, we want to seize that opportunity to build on and to build that discipline and to adapt it for the European context, which obviously is very different from the American one. So what I do is I have two series of ideas that I want to share. The first series is based on the practice of the partners at the family. So what we do in Paris and what we'll do, what we're beginning to do in Berlin and what we'll do soon enough in London is we work with entrepreneurs in the context of office hours. So whenever an entrepreneur has a problem, he wants advice, support, introductions, and so on and so on. They ask for an office hour, and so we spend 1 hour together to discuss their problems and to try to provide solutions to those problems. And so there are frequent questions about the rules, the government, what should I do, how should I deal with it? And often those questions lead them to me because I'm the one who knows government. So those are frequent questions that are here during those office hours and the answers that I usually give. And after those questions, I have a few takeaways that you can take with you today and on the basis of which you can provide feedback. First, the question. So the first question is, should I contact and meet people from the government? I'm an entrepreneur in energy, in agriculture, in healthcare. I know that I'm in a field on which the government is a very important, potent player. Should I start investing in relationships with the government from day one, or should I wait a bit? Should I wait longer and build my product first? So that is the first question. What I answer usually is that remember that the government is a large bureaucracy, and so that means two things. Large means that there are a lot of people working with the government. And so if you decide to go and interact with the government, the chance is you can interact with one people, a second one, a third one. All those people are among millions of civil servants. And it's so large that usually that you can spend your entire day and week and life meeting new people and re-explaining your story and reintroducing your product and so on and so on. So it's so large, you have to reflect before you approach that large organization. What do you want from the government before you decide who you're going to meet? The second important word here is bureaucracy. It's a large bureaucracy, which means that no single individual in that organization can act on their own to provide a solution to your problem. So usually when you go and meet the government, in fact you meet a minister, an elected official, or a civil servant, you explain your problem, and they'll be good listeners. They understand your problem, they empathize with you, and sometimes they even have the beginning of a lead to a solution. But once you leave their office, they're alone knowing your problem, and they can't act alone. If they really wanted to solve your problem, they'd have to convene a meeting with 10 people, 20 people. Then the second meeting, then they have to draft a rule or draft a report, ask their superior if they can change some rules, and so on and so on. And it's such an effort to move such a large bureaucracy that usually the people who will have heard your story and empathize with you won't lift a finger, in fact, after you leave the office. So you will leave the office with a feel-good effect. Oh, finally I've met someone from the government who understands what I'm going through, but that person is unable to solve your problem, because if they really wanted to, they'd have to move that giant bureaucracy. So remember that it's in vain that you try to interact with the government if you're not strategic enough. So the second response that I do is that, so the rule is you shouldn't meet them. It takes too much time and they can't do much for you anyway. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be interested in the government. You have to know what part of the government is in charge of certain things. You have to map the entire government to detect who are the important people, which department is in charge of a particular policy, of a particular rule that applies to your business model, and so on. So that's knowledge management. You have to invest in the knowledge of government, even if you don't spend time with discussing with them in their office. Finally, the reason for that kind of advice is that what makes your strength as a startup entrepreneur is the sense of urgency. You don't have a lot of money on your bank account. You have a very limited period of time during which you need to build your product, find your first users, enter the market and raise funds. So every minute counts in that context, and that minute shouldn't be spent discussing with bureaucrats from the government. You have to know that they exist, you have to know who they are and what they could do for you maybe someday later, but don't spend too much time interacting with them. So that's the response to the first question. The second question that I hear a lot is, well, I'm alone, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm not much, nobody knows me, I'm not on the map, so should I seal an alliance with other entrepreneurs, because together we'll find the strength to lobby the government and to push our agenda forward to make our business models possible. So here, it's a lesson from Chariots of Fire. So who has already watched Chariots of Fire? It's an old movie about young Englishmen in Cambridge, and they run. They train for the Olympic Games in Paris in, I think, 1924. And so they train for that, and one of them has a revenge to take on life. He's Jewish, and so as a Jewish guy, he's a bit of a cast out in Cambridge, and so he decides to win the games to impress his fellow students. And at some point, he trains and he loses the race. He's second, not the winner. He's only the second, and the reason is he looked on the side to see where his main competitor was when approaching the finish line. And so the rule is you never look your competitors, you have to look forward, because it's the way to be there first before your competitors. So that's exactly what I and my partners tell the startups. You shouldn't spend 1 second looking at your competitors. When a VC asks for a map of the competition, when a startup raises funds, we call the VC to explain that, no, we forbid our entrepreneurs to look at the competition. So please don't ask them to draw a map of the competition. They shouldn't look at that. They have to look forward and take care of their users, not look on the side, which will make them lose the race. So what do you do when you are forbidden to look at what the others are doing, when you have the intuition that you should seal an alliance with those others to lobby the government? So what you do is, well, you don't do that. You shouldn't go and talk with other entrepreneurs about regulatory hacking. If you want to hack regulations, you have to hack them by yourself, not in coordination with other entrepreneurs, because most of the time, when you talk with other entrepreneurs in the same industry, they will be less ambitious than you. And a non-ambitious entrepreneur willing to consider regulations will say that, oh, I'm not that ambitious, so what matters is complying, because I want to play it safe and I don't really aim very high. Whereas you, as a good entrepreneur, you're extremely ambitious, so you're willing to take risks. You don't want to be slowed down by someone who's more cautious than you. And so you shouldn't speak with those people, and you should decide on your strategy alone, discussing with your investors, with your friends, with other people, but not with people who are would-be competitors in the same industry. So keep them at a safe distance. So obviously, what I said is in theory. You know some startups in your field. You meet a lot of entrepreneurs in events like that one, but you shouldn't go in the details about regulations with them. The third question is, should I work with incumbent companies? So I'm in energy, so should I go and see the big utilities that dominate the sector? Or in healthcare, should I work with hospitals or with pharmaceutical industry and so on and so on? So the response is no, it's like the competition. You shouldn't interact when you're early stage entrepreneur. You shouldn't interact with incumbent companies. So that's a general lesson best told by Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator. You can look up online at a story by Paul Graham called Do Things That Don't Scale. And one of the part of this long story is about never discuss a partnership with a big corporation, because it always ends up very badly for the startup for many reasons that we can discuss later. But by principles, you shouldn't talk with big corporations when you're startups. So in particular, when we have to talk about regulations, don't speak with those guys. And the reason is that incumbent companies, they're aware that regulations are imperfect, that regulations prevent innovation in some ways. But when confronted with the decision, should we push in favor of changing the regulations or rest and defend the status quo? They always choose the status quo, because the status quo favors the incumbents, whereas changing regulations favors the new entrants. And so when you're an incumbent company, you have a strategic interest in the status quo, and so you shouldn't, as an entrepreneur, really discuss with those people. So it's like the government. Don't meet them, but know that they exist. Obviously, they exist. They're so big, everyone knows the big players in an industry. I think from a regulatory point of view, the most important is to study the history of incumbent companies. For most of them, they're decades old, or they even exist. They even have existed for centuries, and they have been confronted at some point in their history to regulatory problems. Study those cases, make your own opinion on how they succeeded in pushing in favor of new regulations. Understand why the regulations exist. They're here for a reason. Maybe that reason doesn't exist anymore, but they really were here for a reason. So that's what incumbent companies are useful for when you're interested in regulations. Don't meet them, but study them and study their history, because they grew up in a different regulatory environment, And there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from that. So fourth question is, should I pay professionals to handle regulatory matters? I don't know a thing about the law. I don't want to interact with the government in any way. I'm a libertarian, as many entrepreneurs are, so I'm not interested in that. I should pay a lawyer, a lobbyist, a PR team to take care of that, and I only focus on my users and my products. So why do I answer to that is, well, it's a general rule. As a startup entrepreneur, before a very important stage, which we call product market fit, you shouldn't outsource tasks that you didn't learn to perform by yourself. Because if you outsource a task that you never performed by yourself, it will be handled in a bad way. You can't oversee someone doing something for you if you don't have a clue about what they're doing. So if you have regulatory issues at the very early stage, you should do it by yourself. If you have meetings to do, meet the people by yourself. If you have papers to write or journalists with questions, with tough questions about is your model lawful and so on and so forth, you have to answer the questions by yourself. You'll make a lot of mistakes, but those mistakes will be extremely useful because you will be aware of what counts, what matters, what doesn't matter, and at some point you'll be able to give the proper orders to a professional working for you on those matters. So that's for before product market fit. Once you have product market fit, everything changes, as you know, on many fronts for a startup entrepreneur. But you have to go fast to hire a lot of people, to raise money, to pay those people. And at that point, you don't have the luxury to perform every task before you hire someone to do it for you. So past product market fit, obviously, you should hire professionals to take care of regulatory matters, especially lawyers. But hopefully, past product market fit, you will have experienced those regulatory matters by yourself before, and so you will be able to give the proper instructions, to explain your model, to provide the guidelines that will be useful for those professionals to do their job. So work by yourself, know where you stand, and then hire professionals. It's really important to do it in the proper order. The fifth and last question that we hear a lot is, what about the press? So if you attain product market fit, you have a lot of customers, and so many people will hear about your startup. And at some point, journalists will begin to call you and to ask, oh, that's interesting. Apparently, you're raising funds, you're hiring a lot of people, your users are delighted by your product, and so on. But is it legal? We have the impression that what you do is borderline, in terms of lawfulness. So what should you do with the press? So there are a lot of general lessons here. Virgil, you remember them. As a rule, you shouldn't talk to journalists. By exception, you should talk to some journalists, but be really aware of your needs at every stage. If you're still in the process of finding your early adopters, you should only talk to journalists that write for those early adopters. So you're in a special, in healthcare, your early adopters will be those with a certain particular needs and interested in innovation. So you have to find a journalist that covers your business with that particular angle, because you know that behind are readers, an audience that is interested in your product with the right angle. But journalists writing for for a larger audience, for the general public, are not relevant at that point, because your target is never a general audience. Your target is a very tiny segment of that audience where your early adopters are. So it may, you'll have a feel-good effect talking to large audience journalists, having your pictures in a big newspaper, or having saying a few words on the television, which your parents or your grandparents will appreciate a lot, but it doesn't serve your business interests. So you shouldn't spend time defending yourself against accusations of being illegal in front of a larger audience that is not interested in your product yet. If you talk to some journalists, by exception, you must take charge. The best press relations are based on the principle of exerting authority on the journalists. We have our own experience, and we realize, after a lot of mistakes at the family, that a journalist, once he's decided he's interested in what you do, will basically write what you tell them to write. So if they employ the wrong terms, you have to correct them before the paper is published. If they don't spend enough time understanding your model, you have to demand more time to explain it. You have to provide written materials so that everything's clear. Otherwise, you will be covered in a wrong way, and it will create a lot of problems. So don't hesitate to take charge. We feel inferior in front of journalists because they seem to have the power over us. But in fact, good press relationships work when the subject takes charge and tells the journalist what to say. That is what professionals do in that field. We've seen them, and we've learned a lot from them. So finally, remember, so you shouldn't talk to journalists, but at some point you have to start talking to journalists for a very simple reason, is that some important people on the regulatory front only learn things from the papers. That's something we've discovered by ourselves at the family. We write a lot on Medium, we have a lot of videos on YouTube, so we're well known in the entrepreneurial community and the startup world and the tech people and so on. And so at some point, we have the impression of being celebrities in that world. But in fact, when we go out of that small world, we encounter people who've never heard of us and who only hear about other people from the papers. And by contrast, when we have an article about ourselves in the papers, usually we find the article crappy because it's badly written, everything's false in the article. We're called an incubator, even if we're not an incubator. But a lot of people call and write, oh, it's great news, it's marvelous, you're in the papers, it's so wonderful, etc., etc. So the government people belong to that world. They don't have a clue about what you're doing, but if you're in the paper, you're important. So at some point, you have to use the press for that, to impress the people you're lobbying because you have regulatory needs. So those are the 5 questions. So I have another series here, and that is the takeaways. It's less what I discuss with the entrepreneurs during the office hours. It's more my own personal reflection on, well, if you're a hypothetical entrepreneur starting from day one, and you would decide to plan for a strategy regarding regulatory hacking, what should you do? It's hypothetical because usually you'll have other priorities. You have to build a product, you have to quit your job, you have to find money, you have to find a co-founder, so you're not really into reflecting on regulatory hacking. But if you take that time, those are the 5 takeaways that I think are important. So the first takeaway is you should produce your own content. That's an advice we give a lot to entrepreneurs. We provide the example, we write a lot, we have a lot of videos on YouTube, as I mentioned. We even tried podcasts with less success, but we'll try that again at some point. It's very important to produce your own content from the start. It will appear as a distraction, so you have other things to do, and writing a blog story is looks like you're wasting your time. But in fact, it's very important for several reasons, especially on the regulatory front. First, writing about yourself, about what you do, about the problems you're trying to solve, makes you better at what you do, because writing is like speaking, actually, or teaching. It forces you to understand what you're doing and to explain it in the clear terms. And so it's a good pressure on your mind, and that leads you to a better understanding of what you do and to discovering more efficient ways of doing it. So writing is a good practice because, especially writing on, is your model legal? What is the regulatory environment of what you're trying to do? It will force you to go into the details and to better understand what counts and what doesn't count on that front. Second reason why you should produce content is that it's a way to make you known from all interested parties. If you are if you're young and naive, like every good entrepreneur, there are many people that you don't even know they exist. Some departments, some agencies, some competitors, some would-be customers, you don't know they exist. If you produce your own content, they'll learn about you through that content, either directly or because it will be retweeted or shared on Facebook, and so on and so forth. And they'll provide feedback because you are at the early stage. At the early stage, you have the opportunity to get a lot of feedback from early adopters, from fellow entrepreneurs, even from regulators who are interested in new models because it's their personal passion. It's a passion for them. So they'll read your content, they'll send you an email and explain, oh, you wrote that, but it's wrong. You should read that other article about your line of business. And so writing attracts more knowledge, which you can integrate and get better. Finally, producing your own content. Imagine you write maybe 2 blog posts a month for 1 year. That makes 20 to 30 blog posts that are online about your startup, the problem you're trying to solve, your team, yourself, and so on. 1 year later, you have a problem with a regulation agency. A journalist calls, is your model legal? Should you operate or should you cease your operations immediately? They don't have a lot of time to dedicate to understanding what you're doing. But if you can point out to, but I have a lot of blog posts, you should especially read that one and that other one where I discussed that matter. It's useful material for journalists. It's useful material for government people who try to understand their model under the pressure of deciding if you're legal or not. And so having that content already existing online is a really important asset to tackle the challenges that you will meet sooner or later on the regulatory front. So second takeaway is, obviously you understand that the rule that you shouldn't meet any government people is a bit too absolute. You should make exceptions for many reasons. So we had the case of a startup, a French startup, which goes by the name Liberty Rider. So they're developing an app for bikers. Bikers tend to have accidents on roads, and when they have accidents, when they're alone on the road, an hour or 2 hours can pass without any car passing by, and the biker can die without anyone noticing. Whereas if you take care of them during the first 20 minutes, he can live. they can leave. So it's important to send the information that something happened and that someone calls an ambulance, and the ambulance comes by and decide if, takes care of the bikers of the biker on the road. So the problem is, how do you create an application that triggers calling an ambulance? There's no API for that. You don't have an API to call an ambulance. You can't send an HTTP request to call an ambulance at a certain point on a road where nobody passes. So to build that kind of system, you have to discuss with the government at some point. And so those entrepreneurs, their question was very simple. Who should I meet? Should I go in? They're in Toulouse, so it's 3 hours train ride from Paris, so it's quite far. So they asked, should we go in Paris once a week to meet people, to build our system to make sure that every biker who has an accident anywhere in France has an ambulance coming by 10 minutes later. Well, I said, no, you shouldn't waste too much time taking the train from Toulouse to Paris and back to Toulouse, and you shouldn't waste too many hours meeting people from the government. You have an app to build and you have users to satisfy. So what should you do? But it's important in any case. So what should you do? My advice was stay in Toulouse, meet all the relevant government people in Toulouse, the mayor, the MPs, the civil servants in charge of road safety in Toulouse and the surrounding area. That will provide you with a feeling of who they are, and that will provide you with the opportunity to explain your vision. And those people won't be able to solve your problem because they're at the local level. But it will be a good training for you to interact with those people, because at some point they'll lead you to the right person in Paris. And instead of going 10 times to Paris in vain to meet people from the government, you'll go only once or twice and meet the right people with immediate results for your app. So you have to meet people from the government. You have to sell them your vision. Don't sell your product, because people from the government are not tech addicts. They're not interested in apps, in design, in products. They're not early adopters. So you have to talk in the terms they understand. We have that kind of experience at the family. Usually startup people talk in terms of innovation, startups, entrepreneurship, users, code, venture capital. When you use those terms in front of a politician or a civil servant, they're not interested. When you talk about jobs, social security, local communities, social needs, healthcare, and so on, suddenly they're interested because it's what they do on a daily basis. So, and the frequent mistake from entrepreneurs' part is to talk about their product and to go into the code, startup, innovation territory, whereas they should talk about their vision. Too many people die on the roads. And the problem we're trying to solve is why those bikers, after an accident, can be rescued in time so that they leave and go back to their family. That's a vision you can share without even talking about the product. They're not interested. At some point, so what do you need? I need to connect to the government system so that an ambulance can be here in time. That's it. I know who you should meet in Paris. We'll take the appointment, and it goes forward. So learn then language, learn the terms they use and the issues that matter for them. And obviously, the reason for the advice for the Liberty Rider guys stay in Toulouse was that if you talk to government people, you should make sure that they're not too far. You don't have to spend too much time traveling from Paris to Toulouse. That's one reason. The other reason is that those government people to whom you talk should know one another, so that at some point they'll talk about you between themselves, which is the best way to appear on the map. It's like when you raise funds, you should send your deck to VCs who know each other, because at some point they'll talk about you between themselves, and it's the surest way to succeed when you raise funds. So it's the same here. Make sure that they belong to the same government ecosystem, and that they have opportunities to interact, because at some point information about what you do will go back and forth in that ecosystem, and it will create value and name recognition and awareness for your vision. Finally, at some point, you have a problem. So when you have a problem, you can go back to the people who know you in the government, and instead of talking about your vision, you should explain your problem. And a very good practice at that point is, if you ask 3 things from someone working for the government, he will try to, if you have 3 problems, he will try to solve the easiest problem, and he will consider that they did their job. So you shouldn't explain 3 problems. You should stick to 1 problem, the most important, and offer only but one choice. Either you solve my problem and we're friends, or you don't solve my problem and I hate you, and I make sure that to have my revenge at some point. So that's the only way to talk to a minister, by the way. If you need something from a minister or a senior civil servant, a single point, I need you to do that, not you to do that, and also that, because in that case, they choose the easier path. So third takeaway is, what about the others? So the other players, other startups, incumbent companies. So remember what I told during the office hours, don't interact with those guys. So what should you do, in fact? So if there exists what US lobbyists call coalitions, so the way they do lobbying in the US, they're far more professionals than in France. I think in London people are professional. But you have to realize that it's difficult to lobby on behalf of a single firm. It's easier to lobby on behalf of a lot of firms gathering within a single coalition with a shared agenda. So in the US, you have a lot of organizations called concerned small business owners for workers' safety, which is in fact a coalition to loosen the regulations protecting the safety of workers. But one lobbyist is working for hundreds of firms that have put together money and influence and energy to push for a common agenda, and it's easier than being on your own. So startups don't have the time and energy and resources to build coalitions by themselves. So either there exists, a coalition already exists, you should approach the coalition and try to decide if it's in your interest to join the coalition and to stick to the coalition's agenda. Or there isn't any coalition. In that case, you shouldn't waste time building your coalition, because you have a product to build and you have users to satisfy. So if no coalition exists, you should at least participate in events related to your industry, because it's a context in which you won't hear too much about the details of one particular competitor, but you hear a lot about the broad context of your industry, especially on regulatory matters. So it's a good place to be, industrial events, trade events, because you'll hear a lot about that context, and it will help you build that kind of knowledge. If that kind of events doesn't exist, you should organize your own meetups, which is a very good practice in highly regulated industries. Imagine you're in Paris, you're trying to build a healthcare startup. No healthcare tech meetup exists in Paris. I think in London they exist. In Paris, we created them. But if no such meetup exists, you can create it. It's not your meetup, it's a meetup to which you participate. It will attract a lot of people, and you'll hear a lot of interesting stuff about your own industry, and you'll spot the interesting trends and issues and challenges before the others, because behind that meetup, behind that event, there's an agenda, yours. Finally, that's a general rule, pay it forward. If someone approaches you to build a coalition or to join a coalition, you should answer kindly and do what is needed to help, because at some point there will be a payback, which will be good. So it's a good practice in the startup world to pay it forward, in any case, especially on regulatory matters. Fourth takeaway is, well, never lose your focus on the end user. In many industries, highly regulated industries, there's obviously a lot of time to be invested on regulatory matters. But don't forget that your focus is on the end user. So how can you, well, the reason is that nice entrepreneurs finish last. Nice entrepreneurs are those who decide to comply with the rules before building their product and before meeting their first user. We see a lot of them. They spend months filling in forms and paperwork, waiting a very long time for authorization to operate. And when everything's ready and in place and compliant, they start building the product, or they start marketing the product, only to realize that the market has been taken by others who didn't wait for all those steps, or found a way to make them faster. So the good practice here is, obviously don't break the rules, especially if your user's life is on the line, which is the case in a lot of regulated industries. But please don't wait for compliance to take care of your users. So how do you do to take care of your users without having a product? That's, Usama talked a lot about that at the last meetup. It's fake it until you make it. We've seen very good practices in our portfolio from entrepreneurs who didn't have a product sometimes for 6 months or even a year, but they had users from day one, and they found ways to entertain their users even though they didn't have a product yet. So that is the good practice, because those users waiting for your product with you will provide a lot of feedback and will help you on the regulatory front. They'll prove that there's a market. They'll provide you with a lot of information on a problem that isn't solved in the current state of regulations. They'll support your morale, because when you're waiting for agreement by the government, it's important to have enthusiastic users waiting for your product, and so on. Also, don't forget that those users willing to wait for government approval with you during several months or even years are early adopters, and early adopters are a key source of feedback on the problem you're trying to solve, on your future products. And incredibly enough, those early adopters are extremely interested in regulatory issues. So that may look like a very technical issue for you, but when you start to blog about regulations, you'll find that those users are interested. They'll discover that, oh, it's because of that regulation that my problem can't be solved. Or I've seen other models elsewhere that have dealt with that regulation in different ways. So you learn a lot from them producing your content about regulatory matters. Finally, the last takeaway is, at some point, especially in highly regulated industries, you have to have the government on board. So how do you do that? Even though I have just explained for 1 hour that you shouldn't interact too much with the government. So first, I think that grassroots organizing is the point where the US and Europe clearly diverge. There's a historical culture. They are called, that incubator in Washington, D.C., they are called 1776 in reference to the Declaration of Independence. So as some of you may know, it's been written by a guy named Jefferson, and Jefferson is the advocate of a decentralized society, independent citizens organizing themselves in local communities against the central government. So there's something in the US in favor of grassroots organizing. It's deeply ingrained in their culture, in their history, in their cities. And when startup entrepreneurs who has problems with the government wants to organize their users to lobby the government, it works. It worked quite a lot of time for Uber. It worked for Airbnb in some cities and so on. When those companies have tried to do that here in Europe, especially in Paris, we don't, but also in London it happened. It didn't work because people here are not used to organize, to lobby the government. They're more, they expect the government to solve problems without too much pressure from citizens. So it doesn't work here. So interacting with the government shouldn't be through grassroots organizing. You have to get the government on board without counting on the citizens to exert pressure on it. So how do you do? At some point, if you're in capital-intensive industries such as energy, even healthcare, transportation, remember that there are public subsidies that the government is willing to invest in your company. So as a rule, you shouldn't accept that kind of money. That's what we explain to all our entrepreneurs at the family. But if you, at a later stage in a regulated industry, it may be good to accept that money because it will turn the government into one of your shareholders, and they'll have skin in the game, and they'll be forced to support you when you have problems with regulations. So that's exactly what Elon Musk has done with solar energy, with Solar City, and also with SpaceX. Once you have a picture of Elon Musk with President Obama looking at a SpaceX rocket, you have a very good argument for civil servants to change regulations, or for Congress to change regulations to make it easier for that particular company supported by the president himself. So at some point, it's useful to exploit public money to turn the government into an ally instead of a foe. Finally, don't forget that there'll be an election soon enough. And so if the current government hates you and wants to close down your company because it's illegal, you should lobby the opposition, because those guys in the opposition are desperate for new arguments to fight and to win power. So if you arrive with, look at that problem, it's unsolved because existing regulations go against new models that could help solve that problem. Those people don't have time to think about the problems and the solutions. So if you provide them with a ready-to-solve problem with an already existing solution, which is your startup, some of them will be eager to take that and to use that in the political arena. And with some luck, they'll win the election, and you'll have an ally in the government in 1 year or 2 years, which is not that long in regulated industry. So those are the takeaways that I wanted to share. Thank you for your attention, and obviously we can discuss it later.
Disrupting an industry is something hard, and it's taking a long time. If you have a huge traction, should you slow down the traction? No, kind of. In order to, like each, for example, they have way too much traction, should they slow down the process of development in order to keep going with this?
Well, so the question is, a startup with a lot of traction, should it slow it down before hitting a regulatory obstacle and disappointing its users, basically? I think the case of Hitch is a very good one because it's a startup. So who knows Hitch here? It's a Paris-based startup which is about ride sharing in a country where ride sharing looks illegal when in fact it isn't. But you have to make the case that it is legal, and they've been sued in court for being an illegal competitor to the taxi industry, and they're waiting the verdict, the decision. So they had quite a lot of problem. They're quite high in the in the charts of regulatory problems in France. What they did is they didn't slow the traction down in Paris, but they decided to delay opening new cities because they thought, for two reasons. They didn't want to be distracted by opening a new cities while having a lot of regulatory problems in the first city already. Plus, to open new cities, you usually need to raise funds. And if you go and see venture capitalists and explain that you have a lot of regulatory problems with the government and you've been sued in court, some will invest, but most will decide to take a rain check and see maybe another time. So you're in fact you're barred from serving your new customers by lack of funds usually. So it's smart to effectively slow down the traction. In the case of a tangible business like Hitch's, it's enough to decide not to open new cities, and it slows down the traction. If you can do that, you'll have to raise the price or create a waiting list or be innovative.
And how about to move back to don't, because when you disrupt an industry, you have to work kind of with the government.
You mean close your product?
Yeah, not closing completely, but it's kind
degrading
of
the product.
Degrade the product in order so the government is not against you because the media and all that.
I don't see it. There may be some convincing examples. I don't have them in mind, but I don't see it as a winning strategy because.
Are you thinking like Uber in future, Paris, or this stuff?
I'm not thinking about specifically, but I'm thinking like at one point, as it's a slow process and you have to stay friends with the government and all those people, if you go against them, you will diverge and you will never be able to go.
Well, obviously, Uber Pop in Paris is a good example. There were massive and violent strikes by the taxi drivers a while ago against the ride-sharing business opened by Uber under the name Uber Pop. So not professional drivers, but ordinary people driving for 1 hour or 2 hours.
But they had the luxury to open this feature in certain countries and not other countries.
Yes, so they could try it in some countries, and even though they had to close down Uber Pop, they still had UberX and Berlin and other services. So they were still serving the market, only disappointing the drivers, I think, mostly. I don't see it as a winning strategy. But it's Uber, so it's not really a startup. They already had raised billions. They didn't have any problems on their bank account, and their perception by the general public was already sealed by their history. When you're a startup, nobody knows you, and so degrading your product sends a very bad signal to both the general public and your early adopters that you're not willing to fight. And in an economy like the digital economy, which is driven by increasing returns, expectations about your business are extremely important to guarantee your success. If people expect you to win, it increases your chance to win because you'll be drawn into those exponential growth curves by expectations, by market expectations.
And the danger isn't it to die at one point, like each?
To what?
To die, but you could die because if you keep fighting again, so you have to.
Yes, but at that point, it's a matter of culture and of vision. We at the family think that it's better for a startup to be very ambitious and to die than to play it safe and to leave and become a small business. So, because if only because that startup will open the way for for new generations, which will seize the opportunity. So maybe you won't become a billionaire, but at least you'd have contributed to the cause. Which is exactly what Napster did. Napster had to close down because of lawsuits, because of being sued by the music industry and the records companies. And so the records companies thought at the time that it was over and they wouldn't have any problem with any more problems with startups in the future. When in fact, Apple was waiting in the shadow and then Spotify, yes, and Deezer and Beats and so on, and many startups. So it's like D-Day. The first lines fall on the front, and the next lines. Fortunately, in the startup world, people don't die. Yes, go ahead.
In your point of view, is it better to be legal or to be ethic?
Well, Usama answered, is it better to be legal or ethic? Usama answered that if your user's life is not in danger, you should push in favor of ethics, even though regulations go against your model. That's the story of it. The entire history of innovation is made of inventors and entrepreneurs who pushed against the rules, knowing that what they did was illegal. They just counted on the fact that they solved the problem, and at some point, the government would acknowledge that, and so you should push if lives are not in danger, which is another matter. You shouldn't kill people, and that's what's tricky in industries such as healthcare, because in healthcare, obviously you have your users' lives in your hand, and so you should be more cautious. So it calls for different ways of innovating, different ways of financing the startups. It calls for a specific ecosystem, different ecosystem.
I think something interesting regarding that is like if you find like a loophole in the regulation that leaves someone unprotected. Like for example, here in France, the way they angled it was that young people who went out to party, they didn't have enough money to pay for a taxi, so they would end up driving, and so they would end up not being safe. So that goes back to what you said earlier, like understanding how they think. They think about safety, they think about jobs, they think about like income, for example, Airbnb. They talk a lot about like lower middle class people who are trying to make ends meet, and those are the kind of people who rent out their space in Airbnb. So it goes back to that of like understanding their agenda and knowing how to speak to them.
Well, Hitch is they're in a sweet spot here because they don't put people's lives in danger. People die if they don't use Hitch because they drive being drunk, which is extremely dangerous. And Hitch spares people from being drunk, from drunk driving. So they have a powerful argument when it comes to advocating for their model.
So to elaborate, essentially what I'm trying to do currently is employ AI in the regulatory space. So we're working with corporate firms, kind of big firms, and to understand what the workflow is, how they act, and that inevitably leads us to the governmental bodies where it comes down from. So it kind of goes from, and it almost goes back a bit further. It goes from like news, and then it gets bigger and bigger, and then the governments take notice, and then it gets passed, and then the firms have to enact it, and then it gets lobbied, and then it gets a cycle there. So We're a bit of luxury because we're Series A funded and our technology is AI. So we go in and say,
Okay,
how can we help you? Or this is how we can help you.
I understand, but here it's like, by principle, startups shouldn't work with incumbent companies or big corporations. The only exception is if you're operating on an enterprise market, you have to sell to those guys. So obviously you should meet them and sell them your product, but you're a B2B startup. And so that's your core business, to interact with that kind of player. But what you just said reminds me of something that was discussed by Andreessen Horowitz partners a few years ago. They pointed out that, in highly regulated industries such as finance, education, healthcare, regulation stands in the way until artificial intelligence becomes powerful enough to swallow the regulations and to make use of them to help entrepreneurs optimize their model. And then and so it's in finance, for instance, at some point it will be easier for a tech firm to operate on financial market than for a traditional investment bank, because the tech firm will use the technology to absorb all available information and to modelize all the regulations on the market.
How did you know my business plan?
Okay.
That's essentially what we're trying to do, but not to that level, but to start on that path.
Yes, I think we're not there yet, but at some point, the power of artificial intelligence will create opportunities in highly regulated industries for entrepreneurs to enter the market, and without having to deal with the regulations through paperwork.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, so good luck. Last question, maybe? Oui. If not, you can stay a few more minutes and.
Nice small group. We can discuss this exciting. Well, I kind of had a question.
Yes?
I'm cheating because I'm part of the team. So you were saying about the difference between the United States, like the grassroots organizations, and France or Europe in general doesn't work. But I remember this anecdote. It was about like a British politician when somebody went to see them to ask them to change some policy or something, and they said like, I completely agree with you. Now go outside and put pressure on me so that I can justify, doing
Find
that.
signatures.
So I can publicly submit to your will.
Yeah, it's like go make noise so that I can do it. So like, at what point does it make sense for like European startups to make so much noise that it would make the politicians look bad if they didn't do it?
Well, obviously it worked for Hitch on ride sharing, because the youth is a powerful constituency. When you explain to young people that they have to renounce going out at night in Paris because Hitch doesn't exist anymore, you create a problem for a lot of local officials in the suburbs where those young people live. But it's a particular constituency, the young people. They're used to using social media to make their voices heard, whereas more traditional constituencies won't have that kind of access to public expression or social media for that matter. So it really depends on who your users are, how connected they are. If you're a tech startup, chances are that your users are connected in some way, but they're not necessarily used to using Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat to put pressure on the politicians. I think we're in a battle between corporate interests, so trade organizations, traditional lobbies, that are very used to putting pressure on elected officials, and the general public who's still learning we're still in the process of discovering that with the internet and with social media, you have a power at least equal to those traditional corporate interests. I think that in the US it's going strong on that front, but the corporate interests are even stronger in the US because you have an entire industry working to lobby the governments there. Whereas in countries such as France or the UK, where, for instance, you can't finance campaigns like they do in the US, so it's less easy to put pressure on the government through money. You have to find other ways. And my experience is that, well, it's counterintuitive, but usually we in Europe see the US system of private financing of electoral campaigns as the devil. Whereas what I discovered in recent years is that tech companies have learned to use that system to finance campaigns and to exert pressure on politicians in favor of innovation instead of the status quo. And so suddenly a system that used to work in favor of the status quo goes against the status quo because the tech players have learned to play the game. Whereas we in France or we in Europe, we don't have that kind of system, and we see it as a good system not to have private money interfere with the democratic process. The problem is, without the money, the pressure is exerted through other channels. It's, you belong to the same clubs, you went to the same school as the president or the minister, so you can give him a phone call, and it's less easy for startups to use that kind of channels and that kind of leverage.
Less transparent, you mean?
Yes, it's less transparent. The money has a lot of adverse effects, but at least we're on the same line. If you have money, you can buy influence on the government. Whereas if money is illegal in the system, you have to use other currencies such as access. And startups, by construction, don't have access to the highest levels of government. Investors have access, so that's a role that the family is willing to play in favor of entrepreneurs and other venture capitalists. But that's not a game that entrepreneurs should play themselves. And so at some point, they have to rely on their users who vote. But, okay. So thank you for being here tonight. I hope to see you.
Que la famille.